Hello everyone! Welcome back. I know I didn't upload when I usually do. I mean, it's only been 3 uploads before this, but you get what I mean. I think I'm going to be changing it from Wednesdays to Fridays just because it gives me a little extra time to kind of like work around everything that I have to do in like my regular life. So yeah, so I'll now be uploading on Fridays. It took me a little bit to figure all of this out. And the whole reason that I haven't uploaded sooner is because this month is Black History Month and I wanted to highlight 3 specific stories that have Black victims. And specifically, I want to highlight these stories because these stories were treated differently because these victims were Black. The story I'm going to be doing today is that of Tamla Horsford. And if you haven't heard of her case, I'm kind of not surprised. It's one that kind of got swept under the rug, but it was brought back up after everything that happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. This was one story that I kept seeing it on Twitter and on Facebook and just everywhere because it was such an important story, and her story is not being told. At least it's not being told nearly as much as it should be. We always see about Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and all these other serial killers, but we never really hear the stories of Black victims. So I wanted to make sure that I highlighted these. Obviously, I'm going to be doing more that's out of the scope of Black History Month outside of February, but I wanted to make sure that specifically these were highlighted during this month because it's a big deal, especially right now. So Tamla was born in the Caribbean in 1978. She moved to the Bronx with her family when she was 11. She met her husband in Florida, where he already had a daughter, but the two ended up having 5 children together. From the research that I did, I could find that everyone who talked about Tamla, they all described her as an incredibly warm and kind and beautiful person. So many people describe her as charismatic. She loved to dance, and her laugh was apparently just so contagious. So Tamla was invited to a slumber party that was hosted by a group of women that were a bunch of football moms. All their sons played together on the same football team. So the events leading up to Tamla's death is that at 8:30 on the 3rd of November, 2018, Tamla arrived at this slumber party. Before she got there, she had made a meal for her husband and her children and, you know, wanted to make sure that everything was ready for them before she kind of spent the night away. The woman who invited her, her name was John Myers, and Tamla arrived, she had a bottle of tequila and an overnight bag. Once she arrived, she changed into this onesie that had little like paw prints all over it. And in total, for the guests that were there were 9 women and 2 men. So the party was just supposed to be the 9 women, but John's boyfriend, Jose Barrera, he and the husband of another woman decided they were going to stay and watch the football game that was on that night. There was another point where another man was technically there, but he was just there to pick up his wife later on that night and then they left. So Tamla was a smoker, which there's a reason I'm saying that. I'm not just being like, also she was a smoker. So she would often go out on the back balcony throughout the night. She also brought some joints that she would kind of go out and just casually smoke throughout the night. However, starting off with the first racist thing, the group noticed this and started to call her the female Bob Marley, which, like, I don't have time to unpack why they called her that. Tamla was the only Black woman that was there. I guarantee if any other woman that was there had have been smoking weed, they wouldn't have compared her to Bob Marley. So Barrera worked as a pre-trial officer, and he was like vocal about the fact that he didn't like that she was smoking, and John kind of told her like, you know, just make sure you stay out on the back porch or on the back balcony if you're going to be smoking, because Jose doesn't want to see it. So the women were all like drinking and just having a fun night watching the football game and everything. And eventually the two guys ended up joining them to play a game of Cards Against Humanity. So Tamla drank a significant amount of the tequila that she brought, but everyone said that like despite the amount that she had drank, it really didn't seem like she was drunk like at all. However, her blood alcohol level would prove like, yeah, she was significantly intoxicated, but I guess she just knew how to handle her liquor. One of the most famous parts about this case is a photo that was snapped during the night where all the women are sitting on the couch, and Tamla is kind of in the middle of all of these white women, and it kind of just looks like if nothing sinister had happened, we would have just been like, oh yeah, that's a group of friends. It would have been fine. But she's in the middle of 7 white women that have already decided to call her the female Bob Marley. So this is why her death is so suspicious, because she was the only colored woman there and she was the only one that died. Around 11:30, all the women that weren't spending the night left, and the last person to see Tamla alive was a woman named Bridget Fuller. Bridget was picked up by her husband at 1:47 in the morning, and in her statement she said that the last thing she saw Tamla doing was eating a bowl of gumbo, and she told Bridget that she was going to go out for a smoke and then go to bed. So over the next 10 minutes, the security system, which includes a camera, it registered that the back door was opened and then closed again at 1:57. And at this point, everyone's gone to bed and nothing happens until the morning. At 8:45, John's aunt, Madeline Lombardi, she went to make her morning coffee when she looked out the window and she saw Tamla's body lying face down in the backyard. So Lombardi then went upstairs to John's room where she woke her up and told her that her friend from the island was out in the backyard. So Myers and Barrera kind of like rush downstairs to go see what's going on. They go out to the backyard where Tamla is face down, completely face down. That's important. So she's face down and they call 911. Now I'm gonna link the 911 call in the description. I'm gonna talk about it a little bit, but I really, really want everyone to hear it for themselves just because it's not the usual 911 call that you would make if you just found a dead woman in your backyard. So Barrera calls 911 and says, she's not moving one bit, she's not breathing, she's completely face down in the yard, she is stiff. And then Barrera just mentions she was drinking and it looks like, I'm guessing, maybe she fell off the balcony. So the officers arrive and she's pronounced dead at the scene and her body was sent off for an autopsy. However, before her results came back to the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, they'd already decided to rule her death an accident, which they shouldn't have done because they hadn't gotten an autopsy report back. They assumed that with the blood alcohol level that she had mixed with cannabis, that she would have just fallen off the balcony. It was also said that a cigarette and a lighter were found on the upper deck where she had fallen. However, her autopsy report is it's mind-boggling. Listen to this. So her autopsy showed that she had blunt force trauma to the head, which like can kind of make sense if she fell from 2 stories up. She had blunt force trauma to her neck, her torso, and all of her extremities. She also had abrasions on her face. She had cuts on her arms and legs. She had a dislocated wrist and 4 hemorrhages on her skull. She also had a laceration to the right ventricle of the heart. And when her body was examined, the lead investigator, his name was Mike Christian, he stated that, I'm gonna get this right, so I'm gonna read it. Most notable, when Tamla was turned over, was the fact that she had come to rest face down. Her head had not been canted to one side or the other. So the reason that this is interesting is if you were to fall from any height, whether it's 2 stories or just tripping, your natural response is to turn your head one way or another to protect your face, to protect your head. It is one of the most basic human things to do when you're falling. So the case was open for 4 months until they made their final determination on February 20th of 2019 that with a blood alcohol level so high mixed with cannabis, this would have contributed to the fall. Now, here's where things get fishy. Potential evidence was compromised and missed because the scene was never actually secured as a crime scene. Like, they didn't tape anything off, they didn't tell people not to go to certain places of the house, they didn't tell people not to go on the balcony, just a bunch of these things. It was never secured. It was not a secure crime scene. Therefore, so much evidence was tainted. Barrera says that he touched the body, which does make sense initially if kind of like you're making sure, like, are you alive sort of thing. Like, he said he moved her leg, but he also said that he found an unlit cigarette as well as a lighter on the balcony. This was not found by police. This was found by Barrera. He gave them the cigarette and the lighter, but it wasn't proved that that's where it was found. So he could have gone into her bag and been like, look, this is what I found on the balcony. Thankfully, during the autopsy, there was no signs of sexual assault or any sexual trauma, but because the police figured that this death was an accident, nothing was fingerprinted. And Barrera said, oh, don't worry, we have cameras that caught everything. We have cameras all over, so don't worry, I'll get you those tapes. But as you'll see in the next couple of cases that I do, for some reason, oops, the cameras weren't working that night. That's fishy. They declined to test the bottle of tequila and just figured, you know, it's regular tequila, so they didn't have to test anything, which I'm like, you know, there's very limited things that you need to do in that case if you do think it's an accident. However, it's probably in your best interest to make sure no one put anything in that tequila. So apparently, according to one of the officers, is that they don't test for illicit drugs if the person is already dead because they wouldn't be able to track it back to anything, which to me just makes no sense at all. Like, wouldn't you want to know if someone was on some sort of extra drug? I mean, even though her autopsy didn't show it, I still think it would have been a good idea to test the tequila. Obviously, I'm not a forensic examiner, I'm not a medical examiner, I'm not a cop. So what I'm saying only has like a very small amount of weight to it. This balcony theory was kind of hard to prove, aside from like, oh yeah, it makes sense that if she fell, she would have died. But one of the officers named Stacy Smith, she went up there to test this theory. And basically what she came up with was that she completely doubted that Tamla would have fallen. She tried everything and her response was, I don't get it at all. So Stacy told police, according to the transcript that they have that was released by the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, that She said, I mean, I've been on that deck a million times. I've looked and I've tried and I don't understand. So she did this by pretending to lean over as if Tamla was gonna throw up. She did this as if she lost her balance. She did it in a bunch of ways and none of them made sense. She shouldn't have fallen over the balcony. So another officer, Officer Sexton, sympathized with her out of the confusion because it just didn't make sense. They wondered maybe she sat on like the railing to smoke, but why would anyone do that? She had been smoking all night. Why all of a sudden would she decide at this random person's house, I'm gonna sit on the railing 2 floors up and just, you know, smoke my cigarette or my joint or whatever while I'm intoxicated. It is well supported through the people that were there that she shouldn't have fallen because she completely had her wits about her. She wasn't stumbling around, she wasn't slurring her words. Yes, she had a significant blood alcohol level, but she wasn't that messed up. Bridget, the one who left from the party when her husband picked her up at 1:47, later tells the police that Tamla was a seasoned drinker. She said that it would take, and I quote, an enormous amount of alcohol to knock her on her ass. Another woman, Diane Kulavarus, she was friends with Tamla outside of this group. She just had a lot of lingering questions, like nothing that she had been told made sense. According to Diane, she had been getting very inconsistent stories from the women and from the cops. Now, I know I already said this earlier, but things get super, super creepy and super fishy right now. Jose, the one who called 911, the one who works as a pretrial officer, he was fired after using his position to illegally obtain all of the incident reports from this event. I hate that. I hate it so much that he used his connections and his job to get this information that he was not allowed access to. He was not allowed any access to this because he was one of the people that was there. Even though at this point it's been ruled an accident, he's still not allowed to have access to these reports. So a woman named Ashland Harris, she was a huge advocate for reopening this case. She was also the organizer of the change.org petition to get this case reopened. And she has also publicly criticized the Forsyth Sheriff's Department, where she says that they didn't treat this case correctly as well. She alleges that they harassed her. In 2019, she was detained while she was looking for 3 men that were involved in a car accident, which I believe was separate from the Tamla Harris case. It was just another thing that she was working on at the time. She said that her issue with the local law enforcement is that they showed up at her house with a warrant for all of her devices, so like her phone, her laptop, basically anything that she would have used to kind of document what she was looking into. In the midst of all of this, the lawyer that was hired to represent the Horsford family, Ralph Fernandez, released a letter where he summarized all the findings that he did through his own review, and he concluded that homicide is strongly possible. He points to the abrasions that Tamla had on her arms and her hands, as he believes that they were self-defense wounds. And although her crime scene photos have never been released, you can find her autopsy report, and I kind of have to agree. It's really strange the way that she has these cuts and these wounds all over her arms and hands, when if she fell from the balcony to the ground, she would have just landed. unless she got caught in something, but it doesn't really make any sense. Yeah, there were bushes and stuff, but they wouldn't have left the abrasions that she had on her. The autopsy photos became a point of contention. So following Fernandez's letter, the police released a statement to the local news at that time. They claimed that they were standing behind what they had initially found, as well as they're standing behind the evidence through the autopsy photos. So in response, Fernandez was like, nope, not good enough. So he writes a second public statement on June 12th. This includes records of multiple failed attempts to access and secure the autopsy photos. And according to the emails that Fernandez had sent, it was obvious that his request for these photos had just been completely ignored. He didn't get responses. They just didn't answer him. So this is when her case is opened to an independent investigation. This is a huge win for the Horsford family. They don't have any conclusions. They don't have any answers. So they're like, finally, it's going to be looked at independently from the cops, from the people who would kind of like benefit from potentially sweeping this under the rug. I have to use words like allegedly and potentially because I don't want to get sued. Tamla's mother describes her as people gravitated to her energy and her warmth. And in a statement in Rolling Stone, she says, everywhere she lived, it was her home that became the house that all the neighbors and the neighbors' children congregated. So her case has now officially been reopened. This took a lot of movement on social media. It was everywhere. I saw it everywhere. Specifically, I saw it on Twitter. And if you're like me and you spend like most of your life just scrolling through the internet, it was almost impossible not to come upon this case. And as soon as I saw it, as soon as everything came out with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and every other Black person that has lost their life due to some kind of injustice, I knew I had to talk about it. I just didn't know how. I didn't have a big platform. I was just me on the internet. So now that I'm kind of starting to do this and I have a little bit more of an audience, just a small one, I find it really, really important that I talk about this case. I know some of you are going to look at this case and say, it's obvious, she fell, which is completely possible. I just don't think that that's what's happened. The whole reason that an independent investigation was done in the first place is because no one trusts these cops anymore. Specifically, her family and the Black community. They have no trust for the Forsyth County Sheriff's Department. Even the lawyer that they had said that those who were looking after her case were compromised. And he actually said this in a public statement following the death of Rayshard Brooks, who was killed by the police after falling asleep at a Wendy's drive-thru. I can't even begin to understand how in the world that happened, and obviously that's through a lot of white privilege that I don't understand. But at the same time, it's very obvious how Black people are treated and are viewed by police in America. And I'm not saying it's any better in Canada. We have a lot of our own issues. One day I will be doing multiple videos in regards to the Highway of Tears and the missing and murdered Indigenous women all over Canada. So something that I really don't like about this case, and again, I'll see if I can link it below, is when Officer Christensen did his interviews with the women that were at the house and with John Myers specifically, John was almost bribing him. She was like, oh, here are some gift cards that I got for you guys just for all your hard work. And he's like, we can't take those. She's like, oh, okay, well, I'll give them to my kids. There's also different points in this interview where it almost seems like they're blaming Tamla for what happened. they're saying, well, she was drinking so much, and there's just different parts that just don't make sense. They went from people who are so shocked that this could happen because she was so about her wits when she had drank so much, and now all of a sudden this has happened and they're like, oh yeah, it makes sense. I really don't like this particular woman. She just like reeks of white privilege. And I know that's rich coming from a white girl who's sitting here putting on makeup while she talks about murder, but it's true. I'm going to post the photo of Tamla at the party where she's sitting with all the women, and it's a completely normal photo, but it's just so eerie knowing the events that happened later on that night. In fact, it's eerie that we don't know the events that happened late that night. It's not something that anyone thought would have happened, let alone her husband and children, who were expecting for her to come home and have had a good night with friends, but instead they wake up and his wife and their mom are dead. Tamla never seemed to have had any drug problems or any mental health problems. She was just a regular woman who thought she would be going to a slumber party with friends where she would eat gumbo and watch a football game, get a little tipsy, wake up the next morning, probably have breakfast, and then go home. Instead, she was found dead in a backyard where no one seemed to have known anything, where there wasn't any footage from that specific night because the camera batteries had died in their security system. And like I mentioned before, the thing that just makes me so uncomfortable is how her body was found. It was found face down. That's not a normal position for anyone to be in unless foul play was at hand. Her body should not have been found face into the ground. It should have been turned one way or another. Her body shouldn't have had as many marks and abrasions on it as it did. And I absolutely 100% think that something happened that night that no one wants to fess up to. There is a lot to unpack, and honestly, I did my best at finding the information that I could, but it's a hard one to find just because so many people don't want to talk about it. A lot of what you'll find on the internet is a lot of speculation just because we don't have enough evidence to support anything that could have happened, whether it was manslaughter, whether it was intentional. It's really confusing and a really complex story. But what we do know is that a Black woman lost her life that night. Now, you might say, Sarah, you're reaching. There's obviously no evidence that supports this. Or it's totally possible that she fell over this barrier, this balcony, which is true. But in 2021, after everything that has happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, it is our duty as white people to make sure that cases like this actually are looked into. It's our responsibility to make sure that the death isn't decided before the autopsy. I know I'm a bit more worked up than I have been in previous videos, but I don't have a choice. In the previous videos, those have been about the privilege of white males being able to blend into the crowd. No one noticed them because they looked like the cops that were hunting them. No one's going to question that. But in this case, with a Black woman, it's going to be a little different. There's a lot of reasons that, you know, when I'm walking down the street, I can feel nervous or maybe even a little scared because there's a guy following me, or, you know, you do that thing where you hold your keys in between your fingers because it's late at night. And I worry about that because I'm a woman. I can't even imagine the struggles that Black women go through in order to try and protect themselves. I'll never know that. I'll never know what happened to Tamla that night, and I'll never know the fear that she faced. So it's my responsibility to make sure that her name is said, her name is put out there, her name is known, because it's time to stop sweeping cases like this under the rug. 5 children and 1 stepchild lost their mother, and a man lost his wife. If it was an accident, that's heartbreaking. But a lot of us in the true crime community don't feel it was an accident. We believe that something sinister happened that night, that the tapes were erased, that the body was placed, and everyone went to bed, and it was fine. They were fine with what had happened. You can have your own opinions on this, but to me, something bad happened. I know that this look wasn't that fantastic. I really was more focused on making sure that I got all the information that I've collected, and I wanted to make sure that I got it right. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't making any kind of snide jokes or anything like that when it came to this story. Usually my jokes involve the perpetrator and kind of how much of a creep or psychopath they are, but in this case there isn't a perpetrator, at least not one that we know of. I'm going to link the 911 call and the interviews that were done for the witnesses that were there that night, and let me know what you think. It's a very complicated case. Please don't sue me. I just really want there to be justice for the Horsford family and for Tamla. It'll really say a lot about if this case is finally brought to a conclusion, a proper conclusion, not one that was made 10 minutes after getting there. I don't know why I put these back on. I will do my best to stay vigilant as someone with white privilege. Next week, I will be talking about the case of Kendrick Johnson, which is a Black teenager who was found dead at his high school. And again, it's not solved. It was completely botched, and it just proves that cases with Black victims are not taken as seriously as cases with white victims. Well, very intense. I'm going to keep it at that. I don't really have a whole lot else to add. It's a really complicated case, like I've said. I'm kind of just repeating myself at this point, but I really just want to make sure that I'm getting the point across that this case is about Tamla. This case is about her and the Black community and the struggles that the Black community faces. The least I can do is talk about it on this very small platform. I hope I didn't scare you guys off too much with how intense this one was. I know I sound very biased when it comes to this case, and it's because I am, but it's the least I can do to show support for the BLM movement and for my friends that are people of color, and I just want to be on the right side of history. Have a good day, and I'll see you next week. Bye.